Welcome everyone to our third webinar in the 2014 series on local data for resilience. My name is Franziska Schreiber from the Resilient Cities team at the ICLEI World Secretariat in Bonn, Germany, and I'll be hosting this webinar for you today. First, a quick technical note. We will keep all participants muted for the duration of the session to minimize background noise. If you have a question or are having technical difficulties, please send us a message in the question chat box. For those of you who don't know about us, let me start with a quick introduction. ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, is an international membership organization for local governments around the world with over 1,000 members in 84 countries. We promote local action for global sustainability and support cities from our global, regional, and country offices with targeted programs and events. ICLEI convenes the annual Global Forum on Urban Resilience and Adaptation to Climate Change here in Bonn every spring. This year, the Global Forum will take place during the UNFCCC Climate Change Talks. The webinars focus on a selection of key themes from our 2014 Resilient Cities Forum, showcasing selected speakers from the forum and additional experts and local government representatives. The webinars build on discussions started at the conference, keeping the dialogue ongoing and providing a resource for those unable to attend while anticipating new directions and innovations in 2015. I would like to mention for those of you interested in contributing to next year's Congress program that our call for contributions will close by the end of the day. You may wish to submit on the topic of local data and indicators or on one of the many other topics related to urban resilience and adaptation. In today's webinar, we will discuss different plans for generating data on local vulnerability and resilience and focus on the importance of standardized indicators and city data to take a uniform approach to what is measured and how this is implemented. Standardized indicators help cities assess their performance and progress while allowing them to draw comparative lessons. We will look at developments in this direction, including the ISO 37120, the first international standard on city data. Today's agenda includes two presentations, totaling about 30 minutes, followed by a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session. Joyce Coffey from the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index will introduce the open source index, which measures national vulnerability and resilience, and discuss future plans to apply the index also to urban assessments. José Luis Hernández from the World Council on City Data, in short WCCD, will then discuss why standardized indicators and city data are crucial and how the World Council on City Data can facilitate this development. Please hold your questions until the end. You can type them in as we go along, and we will read them out at the end. When doing so, please indicate which speaker the question is for, and if you like, the name of your organization. As previously mentioned, please also type in any technical questions so we can help you sort them out. To get things started, I would like to introduce my colleague Alberto Terenzi, Officer for Sustainable Resources, Climate and Resilience at the ICLEI European Secretariat, who will give a brief introduction to the topic of local data for resilience and standardized indicators. I will now hand over to Alberto. Okay, so it seems that our colleague Alberto has just dropped off, so we will immediately go to our first presenter, which is Joyce Coffey. She is a Managing Director of the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index for Global Resiliency. Previously, she was Vice President at Edelman, providing multinational companies with corporate social responsibility strategic counsel. She directed the City of Chicago's Climate Action Plan and managed water and air resources in Chicago's Department of Environment. Joyce started her career in Asia with the World Bank and USAID. Today, Joyce will present the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, which ranks 177 countries based on their vulnerability to climate change and readiness to adapt, and elaborate on the revised indicators that are being used to measure the overall vulnerability and readiness of a country. She will also introduce different plans to downscale the index to the city level and discuss how this can be achieved. Joyce, please go ahead when you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you, Francesca. And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
So
it's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you today, and I want to just give a shout out to ICLEI. I've been a fond user of your materials for over a decade, and I'm certain that my professional career has been greatly enhanced by the work that you do, especially the convening.
Sorry, just for interrupting you, but we cannot see your screen. I will try again.
Oh, all right. I did not receive a share screen request from you.
Okay.
Here it is.
Yeah,
I'm
wonderful.
so sorry.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm sorry for the technical difficulty there. I was, though, wanting to remark on the fact that the work that I have done has really greatly benefited from ICLEI, and perhaps you will see some of ICLEI's influence in the Global Adaptation Index, which, as Francesca mentioned, is the world's leading index showing which countries are best prepared to deal with not only climate disruption, but also natural resource constraints and overcrowding. I'll just start, though, by sharing a few observations about the fact that not only do local government and other government officials care about climate change, we're seeing it as a growing risk perceived in other sectors as well. The World Economic Forum every year comes out with their Global Risk Perception Survey, and this year in January I was struck that more than 4 of the items on their top 10 list on the 10th year of their survey in fact relate to what I would consider to be climate adaptation. And this is a survey of the leadership primarily in the corporate sector around the world. So we have many stakeholders that are very keen to know more about risks that relate to climate change. And another survey that suggests that is the Carbon Disclosure Project, now known as, who suggests that more than 70% of their respondents see risks in their supply and value chains from climate disruption. One of the key features of this shift, however, in CDP's data gathering is that in the past, when this question was asked, what are the risks you see from climate change, the respondents said the risks related to greenhouse gas markets. And now, when they respond to that question, they say the risks relate to disruptions to their supply chain. So there has been a significant shift in terms of awareness that climate impacts are in fact affecting value chains. Of course, the other very key feature, especially for our work, because the mission of the Global Adaptation Index is not only to increase the world's understanding about the need to adapt, but also, very importantly, to save lives and improve livelihoods in vulnerable communities by increasing investment for adaptation towards them. We see that there has been a significant erosion of our poverty alleviation goals around the world due to climate disruption. So in the lower income countries, the overlap between adaptation and mitigation is less. It's more an overlap between poverty reduction and adaptation, which I think is a really key feature for anyone on the phone who's managing efforts in lower income and least developed countries, that we have a lot more momentum around poverty reduction, and we can really gain a lot of ground by focusing on that. So the Global Adaptation Index, you should feel free, by the way, during this presentation to listen to me with one ear and one eye and go to the index.gain.org or nd-gain.org site to perhaps take a cruise through the index yourself, to keep in mind that, as I mentioned, we really are looking to raise the world's awareness about both the risks and the opportunities for development and corporate agencies in a climate change world. And we feel like the data that are shared in an index, especially one that is free and open source, so you can really get to the bottom of what it is we're trying to describe, are relevant to many questions that are asked, not only around policy and governance, but also around risk mitigation, innovation, and corporate social responsibility. Just briefly, the index looks at 177 countries, 45 indicators for every one of those countries across 18 years of data, and the variables are both vulnerability and readiness, and we'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. And as I'm talking through this, I will also leap to the end of my presentation and just say that we do have in mind that urban will be the key feature moving forward for our work, because all of you know much better than I, in fact, that the urban questions of adaptation are much more relevant since local solutions than they are at the country scale, since local solutions are really going to be the only way we come up with the kind of climate change we need to see. So we're in the midst of several city pilots, and luckily our framework and methodology are downscalable to the city very readily. Our only constraint is the access to data and comparable information across geographies. So before I get into what the index is, I'd like to just share a little bit about who uses it, because I think it's valuable for you to see that the demand that we're seeing not only for the country scale index but also the urban index. Certainly we're used by development agencies. Here the Catholic Relief Services has asked us to look at relative risk in the 92 countries where they have missions, in particular to see whether they need to shift any of their resources from, for instance, Latin America, where they do a lot around climate adaptation and agriculture, to Africa, where more of that could be done. Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, the major architecture firm, uses the index to help inform their clients why they need to include some more belt and suspenders around adaptation, in particular, for instance, air quality improvements for this picture here, the Chinese marketplace. Very local companies. In the United States, we have a company called True Value. They're sort of a Main Street hardware company, a cooperative, certainly considered very United States oriented. So you might wonder, how do they feature in a global index? But in fact, the vast majority of their supply chain is overseas, and so mapping the 32 countries from which they gather the vast majority of their supplies to look at where the major risks are and what they need to be doing to shore up those risks, and hopefully therefore improve the outcomes in those countries as well, is another feature of how the index is used. And finally, another image here of ArcelorMittal, the major steel manufacturing firm. When they do a merger and acquisition in Mali, for instance, to extract a particular commodity there, they really need to do a lot to both earn the license to operate there, as well as to shore up infrastructure, both human and physical, to increase the viability of their projects, and they use the index to determine where those priorities should be. So just a very brief overview that, as I said, we rank 177 countries, and we're looking at all the countries within the United Nations, minus a few that don't have enough data to be credible. Those rankings can then be massaged into other analysis, including what we call the vulnerability and readiness matrix that ranks each of the countries within the index according to their relative vulnerability and readiness, and shows over time, because it can be a time series illustration, how countries have moved from being highly vulnerable and not ready, which would be those countries that are most probably receiving development assistance, to that highly vulnerable but much more ready place. So countries in this quadrant, the blue quadrant, are in fact often very interesting to high net worth individuals and financial firms, for instance, as well as to entrepreneurs and large companies that are looking to grow their marketplaces, because as we know in the corporate sector, a known risk is actually often an opportunity, and so part of what GAIN can do is to unveil those risks. Every one of the countries within the index includes a country profile, and that profile will list all of the 45 indicators, showing the trend for those indicators across the 18 years of the data have been collected, and you can take yourself within any one set of those data to the source itself and see, you know, and look at, in particular, the data in aggregate. We also do feature for every one of the indicators a comparison across similar countries, so that, for instance, if you were working with the government of Brazil and wanted to speak with them a little bit about how they might need to improve their paved roads, which is one of the worst areas of their resiliency, you could show them that the paved roads indicator for Brazil is similar to Cote d'Ivoire and other countries that they might be surprised by. So the country profile is, for instance, the sort of thing that ArcelorMittal would have used in their merger and acquisition prioritization with the government. So just as I end the brief overview of the index, to note that our focal areas include, I think, many things that people on the phone would agree with us relate to adaptation, right? Water, food, health, infrastructure, ecosystems, and human habitat. But we also include a set of measures that we call the readiness to accept adaptation investment. So these relate to economic opportunity, governance, and social structures. And the reason for this is that, frankly, corporate decision makers and even development decision makers say that the first thing that they look at when they look at the resilience of a country is not the, you know, climate models from the IPCC, which are included in our index, and it's not necessarily the urbanization of the country or even their education level, but it is in fact their governance. So I think we want to be sure that we're including measures that relate to the kinds of questions that keep decision makers up at night, and allowing them to see those questions in the same breath, really, as they are breathing the climate question. So I think, as I close, just to note that one of the really important understandings that all of us on the phone likely have is that lower income countries are in a graver place as it relates to resiliency, and that's one of the things that I think the Global Adaptation Index has worked hard to try to help the world understand. The disproportionate risk is in fact spread across the world, but felt most gravely certainly by Africa, and other countries in Asia as well see a high level of risk that is in fact surmountable. So just to keep in mind that this is now going back to the Global Adaptation Index matrix showing relative vulnerability and readiness, and we've just taken a few countries here to illustrate that over the course of the last 18 years there has been some significant improvement in certain countries that puts them in the position of being much more able to accept investment that will increase their resiliency, and also, of course, they've increased their own adaptive capacity over time as well. So that's shown here, for instance, by Rwanda, which has made a march over 46 points up the index in the last 18 years to a position of being much more viable in terms of its governance that would be ready to accept investment. And I'll close just by saying that, you know, ICLEI does a beautiful job of convening, and as a small nonprofit, we also try to convene thought leaders around these global adaptation questions. We have an annual meeting every year in Washington, and we also have a prize, which I wanted to just put a fine point on here today, because I'm hoping that some on the call would be interested in submitting a very simple application that will come out this summer, so stay tuned for that. Our future plans include the urban assessments that I mentioned earlier. We're starting with a Kresge Foundation grant in the United States to first make sure that we are defining our indicators correctly with an advisory committee of experts in urban adaptation in the United States, and then to apply the framework that I've just described to a set of cities. And of course, we will also, in tandem with that, be doing work in some lower income cities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We're also primed to do sector-based assessments and have done some of this work for some that have asked that relates to, for instance, the sector of food or of water. And finally, we would, if given money, funding, be very pleased to do state assessments, and have been looking particularly at Brazil and India to do that sort of work. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joyce, for this really excellent presentation. And a reminder to the audience, type in any questions you have for us to read out at the end. We will now move to our second speaker, José Luis Hernández, who is the Vice President of the World Council on City Data. And prior to joining the WCCCD, José Luis worked for the Canadian Standards Association, the American National Electrical Manufacturers Association, and the Mexican Association for Standardization and Certification. He also held the international secretariat of various ISO committees, such as the ISO Climate Change Coordinating Committee, the ISO Technical Committee on Environmental Management, the Subcommittee on GHG Management, and the ISO TC 268 Working Group on City Indicators. José Luis holds a diploma in mechanical engineering with a major in energy. José Luis will discuss the importance of standardized indicators and the role of the World Council on City Data in coordinating efforts in open source city data and implementing the ISO 37120, the first international standard on city data. He will also share the results from the 20 foundation cities that have adopted the ISO 37120 and are now certified under the WCCD and included in the Global City Registry. José Luis, I'll hand it over to you now.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
we can hear you.
See my
Perfect.
screen?
Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
great.
We can also see your screen.
Okay. So, thank you very much for that introduction, Francisca, and for the opportunity to come today and make this presentation about how we are at the World Council on City Data. We are connecting cities with globally standardized city data. My presentation will cover two main subjects. One is going to be ISO 37120, the first international standard for cities, about city indicators, and the second part of my presentation will be about the World Council on City Data. So first, let's start with how we develop this international standard on city indicators. In 2008, the World Bank approached the University of Toronto with a specific project in mind. The project consisted in review the indicators that 9 cities had and see whether those city indicators were comparable. The results of the pilot project that was conducted in 2008 were astonishing. I think that the outcome was exactly what the World Bank was expecting. That was that at that time there were not harmonized or standardized city indicators, because we found that across those 9 pilot cities, they had a total of 1,100 indicators, but only 2 were comparable. Because of that reason, the Global City Indicators Facility was created as part of the Global Cities Institute of University of Toronto, and we developed the first set of standard indicators. That was the first attempt to come up with an international standard. Those indicators have been used by 255 cities across 82 countries. This initiative was very successful, and because it was so successful, in 2012, we approached the International Standard Organization to develop the first international standard on city indicators. The project was assigned to ISO TC 268 on sustainable development of communities, and working group number 2 on city indicators was established to look after the development of this standard. As you can see in this slide, working group 2 is also responsible for another document that is 37121 that is under development, and that I will discuss later in my presentation. For your information, this ISO TC 268 has 2 working groups. One working group, in addition to working group number 2, working group number 1, that is on system management. This is a system management standard that has various issues or themes that need to be addressed. they are making reference to the city indicators in 37120. Working group number 3, that is terminology, and this ISO-TC also has a subcommittee number 1 on the smart community infrastructure, and 2 working groups working on infrastructure
Muted.
and smart community infrastructure. It took us 6 international meetings, 6 meetings to go over the 5 different working drafts that we developed, and it took us we had to address about 300 comments before we could publish the international standard. The participation was pretty positive. 20 countries were actively participating either at the working group level or at the technical committee level when the standard was balloted. In 2012, after 2 years of working in this standard, there was a real accomplishment because it usually takes over 5 years to develop an international standard. In 2012, last May, the first international standard on global city indicators was published. The number, as you know, is ISO 37120, and it's Sustainable Development of Communities, Indicators for City Services and Quality of Life. But what is ISO 37120? Well, ISO 37120 is a set of standardized indicators that provide a uniform approach to what is measured and how that measurement is to be undertaken. In other words, we have indicators, metrics, definitions, and we have a methodology. The standard contains 100 indicators. 46 are core indicators, meaning that those indicators have to be reported, and 54 supporting indicators, meaning that those indicators are optional. So a city has to report as many supporting indicators as possible. Something important is that this standard is setting a common language for reporting. The indicators in the standard cover 17 themes that you can see on this slide, like economy, education, energy, environment, water and sanitation, solid waste, telecommunication, and innovation. So all the 100 indicators can be grouped into these 17 themes. This is a list of the 46 core indicators that we have in the standard. But who are the users of the standard? Well, this standard, first of all, is applicable to any city, municipality, or local government. Second, the standard can be used by mayors, by city managers, by city planners, by politicians, by researchers, or by business leaders, designers, and professionals. Can be also used by citizens because this standard gives citizens the tools to make accountable the city for the services they provide. But why do we need a set of globally standardized indicators? Why do cities need these indicators? Well, to manage and make informed decisions through data analysis, we all know that if we can put it in numbers, we can manage and improve those metrics. They can also help us to benchmark, or can help cities to benchmark and establish targets. If we know where we stand, we can come up with aggressive and realistic targets. We can plan and establish new frameworks for sustainable planning. We can leverage for funding with senior levels of government, because if we know exactly where there's a need for improvement and we can measure it, we can approach senior levels of government and let them know that there's a room for improvement in a certain area, and we can ask them for funding. It can help us to evaluate the impact of infrastructure projects on the overall performance of a city. Just to give you an example, if we are building a new line of subway, we can very easily and with a very easy metric to see what the improvement or what the impact to citizens will be. We can build creditworthiness, build smart, sustainable cities, and very important, we can learn and share lessons across other cities globally. But why also city stakeholders need a set of globally standardized indicators? Many of the reasons I gave before are the same for these for stakeholders. I'm just going to mention a couple of them that are different. One of them is to determine entry points for investment. I think that companies and stakeholders are willing to invest in cities where there's data available, where they know exactly what they are going to be confronting, where they know, for instance, what the city composition of the age composition of the city is to target a specific market. They can also benchmark investment and evaluate the impact of their investments. Working group number 2 is right now working on a revision to ISO 37120. As I mentioned before, the first edition of the standard was published last May, but we have already started working on a revision to the standard to expand on existing themes. Like for instance, we're going to be expanding on the energy theme. Currently, we only cover electricity, and there's a proposal from Japan and Germany to include other sources of energy like propane, for instance. We will be including new indicators. There's a proposal from Sweden to include food security indicators, and we will be revising few existing indicators or themes. But also this working group is developing a technical report or a new document that is ISO 37121 that will be for sustainable development and resilience in cities. And these are some of the new indicators that will be covered by this technical report. In other words, we will be doing a research. We will be identifying documents that are available that cover indicators on all these themes. Now let's move to the second part of my presentation, that is a pilot project of ISO 37120 that we conducted here at the World Council on City Data. When ISO 37120 was published last May, the World Council on City Data was also established to host this international standard. This is the list of over 20 foundation cities that you can see here in this slide, that we have cities representing all the regions in the world. We have cities in North America, Asia Pacific, Latin America, West Asia, Africa, and Oceania. So the 20 foundation cities we have and the ones that we're piloting ISO 37120 cover a vast region in the world, and also we have developing and developed cities. The outcome of the pilot project was presented, the lessons learned were presented last November 17 and 18 at London City Hall, when we had the first meeting of our 20 foundation cities. I have to say that the outcome of that meeting and the comments we heard from our foundation cities were pretty positive. They see a lot of value in using data. They presented some examples of how they are using data to improve the quality of life and the quality of services to be provided. This slide that I'm presenting now is just to give you an example of some of the indicators that were presented. We had, for instance, greenhouse gas emissions, and some people were making some correlations with electrical energy use. But all these data has been posted and uploaded, rather, in our WCCD web portal. The WCCD web portal, we have the capability of presenting a graph view. For instance, in this case, you can see that we are presenting one indicator, that is number of automobiles, and you can see here how cities are doing in regards to that indicator. We can also do comparison among 2 or 3 indicators. In this case, here we're comparing PM10 concentration, that is an environmental or environment indicator, with life expectancy and with total city population. These are 3-dimensional graphs, and we have estimated that using all the indicators in the standard that are 100, we can create 1.2 million of different set of graphs and correlations using ISO 37120. The web portal can also help us to do city comparison view. For instance, in this case, we can see how London, Toronto, Boston, Dubai, and Amsterdam are doing, and you can see across how they are doing in one in a specific indicators, and you can compare one indicator to in one city to another city. We can also have this indicator view, where it's for a specific indicator, and you can see how the different cities are doing. As cities continue reporting more data, and as cities, as we grow the data in our WCCD web portal, we plan to create other features or capabilities of the work portal. And one of them is a prediction tool. If we have data for 3, 4, or 5 years, we can start creating some trends to see where the city will be standing in 2 or 3 years after in regards to a specific indicator. So this is one of the features that we plan to build on the WCCD web portal. For those cities that might be on the call and would like to be, to know how they can become an ISO 37120 city, that is a certification program that we have created at the WCCD. First, they have to submit an expression of interest and application form. Then they will have to file the 46 indicators, and there will be a verification of all those indicators by third-party verifiers. Then the city will be registered in the ISO 37120 or in the WCCD Global Cities Registry. And then the city will be part of the WCCD. This is an example of the expression of interest that cities will have to submit. You can get a copy of this expression of interest by sending me an email, or you can access our website that I'm going to point out in the presentation. Is www.dataforcities.org. You can get there the expression of interest, or you can send me an email. I was planning on sharing with you a video on the World Council on City data. Unfortunately, we cannot share it because I can share video, but I can't share audio, so you won't be able to hear the video. But I will invite everyone to go to Vimeo. As you can see here, and it's also, that's true, it's also on the homepage of the website. So if you go to www.dataforcities.org, the video is there, or you can access this through the Vimeo website. I think the organizers of the webinar will be providing everyone with this link so that you can have an opportunity to see the video. And if you have any questions or you are interested in receiving more information, please send me an email. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to present today. Again, my name is Jose Luis Hernandez. I'm with the World Council on City Data, and you can see my telephone and my email on this slide. And if you have any questions, please, you can send me an email or contact me directly by phone. Thank you.
So we have 2 questions from Evgenia for Joyce. The first one is, do you think that there will be any losses in quality of the index from downscaling the index from the state to the city level? And the second question is, could you please elaborate on the prize you will award next year? And for instance, what does it comprise of? So we would be very interested in hearing more on that.
Great. Great question. So can you hear me? I guess in answer to the first question,
I can hear you.
The downscaling is not a statistical downscale. So I would agree with the supposition that downscaling the country index to the city level simply by using a statistical inference over population or square meters would result in very gross and rough information. We do not propose to do that. What we're proposing to do is to use data like the free and publicly available open source data from WCCD, which is such an extraordinary resource, to do metrics that relate to specific city data. The only sort of statistical downscaling that would be part of this work is the predictive models that come from, for instance, climate change. So you would look at maybe the projections of floods or projected heat waves, or even projected amount of land below a certain level, sea level, that might be flooded. And those data could be downscaled to using statistical methods. But of course, even there would be, and there will be, accounting for specific variables within cities, because that all relates to specificity around their geographies as well as the predictive models. So that was an excellent question, and I think one of the reasons why the city index is much harder to do than the country level index is that, as WCCD, Jose Luis, pointed out at the very beginning, there were, until WCCD came along, only 2 indicators out of many hundreds that were comparable across cities. And so we needed those data in order to make this work. And secondly, I think the other key feature is that although we see a great demand for data to be compared, many development agencies that work with cities fear comparison. They think it will make certain cities look less viable for many things. Corporations wish for those data, and without it they make very imperfect decisions, and that's true of development agencies as well. So, but I will say that the cities, we need to do a very good job of sharing context in order for our city index to be relevant. And then a brief response to the second question about the Corporate Adaptation Prize. So it is a reputational-based prize. In the past, corporations like Novartis, Ushahidi, Monsanto, PepsiCo have won the prize for projects ranging from water conservation and smart agriculture in Africa with smallholder farmers to public health and pharmaceutical distribution in India that is based on a business model, not philanthropy. None of these are simply philanthropic. They all relate to resources coming to and from corporate and community, to using the cloud for information that helps with disaster risk reduction. And we celebrate the prize winners at Climate Week in New York City in September every year at an event that's attended by several hundred, and we use the major media machine that is the University of Notre Dame, which is a university based in the Midwest of the United States that gets a lot of press, at least in the United States, but also internationally, to try to feature the extraordinary work of these corporate collaborations that are working generally with local governments, nonprofits, and local companies as well as the multinational.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joyce. We have another question, this time for Jose from Alberto, and he's asking, are qualitative and process indicators also included in this standards, or is it only quantitative indicators that you're using?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, ISO 37120 only has quantitative indicators. So in other words, all those indicators we have, they are, aligned with a specific metric. So all the indicators, all the 100 indicators in ISO 37120 are quantitative.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Jose. We have another question for you from Jim McCabe, and he's asking, what certification bodies are certifying compliance to the ISO 37120 standard, and how do others apply?
Well, the WCCD, we are doing certification. I think we are the only organization now providing certification of ISO 37120. We were the creators of the standard, so we have the expertise, and we've been doing similar job through the Global City Indicators Facility. So at this point, we are the only organization doing certification of ISO 37120. We have a lot of connections, and we have a lot of outreach with many cities around the world through the Global City Indicators Facility, and so far we are the only organization providing that service.
Thank you very much. The next question is a general question, so it's open for both Jose and Joyce. It's from Elisa, and she asks, can you point out some specific issue areas or indicators where data is hard to get at the city level, particularly related to the issue of governance? Joyce, do you want to start answering that question for us, please?
Sure. So, well, before you said related to the issue of governance, I was going to say water-related indicators are quite difficult to get for cities, not because the data are not available, but because water issues don't generally tend to be limited to the boundaries of the city. So, and also, of course, different countries have different definitions of cities. So, the water district may be county-based. It may be based on a watershed. and that also relates to sewage questions. So a lot of the infrastructure, because it's any infrastructure indicators, because they're not owned by cities, can be difficult to gather. And then the second question, specifically around governance, I think one of the key questions that when we deal with our corporate audience they have has to do with things that go beyond this question of the ease of doing business and get into innovation. So how do we measure a city's innovation capabilities? One of those measures that we currently use in the country level index has to do with the number of patents filed, but there are likely other indicators at the city scale that could show us the amount of innovation that's encouraged at that city scale.
Yes, well, ISO 37120 has indicators on governance, and I think that first I'd like to address the first part of the question about the issues or the challenges in collecting data. We've seen here at the World Council on City Data that there are two main challenges in collecting data. One of them is how do you define the city boundaries? Sometimes it is difficult and cities define boundaries in a different way. Sometimes cities have data for the city proper, like for instance for City of Toronto, but other cities might have data for the greater Toronto area, for example. So one of the challenges in collecting data is how do you define the boundaries in the city? Remember that ISO 37120, one of the purposes is that we can collect data and then we can compare indicators across different cities. So one of the main points here is that all cities must have or should have the same boundaries so that we can compare data. So the first issue is boundaries. The second issue is about collection of data. Some of the data is not available to the city level. Some of the data is available to the national level, to the federal or provincial level or the state level. So sometimes for some cities it's a little bit of a challenge to try to collect data for a specific indicator because the data we need is at the city level. So I would say that those are the two main challenges we have when we collect data. Now, talking about governance, what we've seen is that sometimes governance, well, first we need to understand that we are dealing with cities around the world, with different countries, different cultures, different political systems. So sometimes those differences make a huge difference. So sometimes a governance indicator in North America maybe doesn't mean the same in Africa or in Latin America. So we still see the value in governance indicators. They give us a good sign of how the city is doing in that theme. However, for some cities can be a little bit of a challenge to report on those indicators, not only because data is not available, but also because, or primarily because of the political system those cities have. So I would say that in conclusion is the issues with collection of data are city boundaries, collection of data or disponibility or availability of the data to the city level, and for some specific indicators there might be some cultural or political differences that make a challenge to collect certain data.
Thank you both. These were really interesting answers. We have another question from Stephen Taylor, which is also open for both of you. And he states, the challenge is always to obtain data, particularly historical data. So how do cities pay for data collection? And how would either of these data sets address the question of data collection? Maybe we start with Joyce again.
Sure, and I guess I feel a little bit less expert in handling this question of how cities should pay for data because we haven't yet gotten cities engaged with the Global Adaptation Index. But so that's part of why our intent here is not to impose upon cities the requirement that they give us data. In fact, what we hope to do is the same that we've done with the country index, which is to collect data that's been verified from other sources and then to compare it, because cities are already incredibly burdened. I recall myself as a city leader that collecting data was near the bottom of my list of things to do in spite of the fact that I knew it was very important. So we do not expect to be asking cities to pony up resources of any time to gather data. I do, however, want to propose a potentially unique way of gathering data that might be cost-free for cities, and that is crowd-sourced data. And this is a mechanism that ND Gain is investigating very carefully with IBM, SAP, and several other players to consider whether or not there are ways to gather data from the cloud that are crowd-sourced, such as SMS data, Twitter data, and Google data that can tell us something about city risk and resiliency. And the really interesting thing from my perspective is that many of these data are in fact from the community. One of the criticisms that I think is very fairly wrought on many indicator initiatives is that they don't necessarily reflect, for instance, informal settlements or individuals that are not necessarily counted by central governments. And crowdsourced data could, in some cases, include data from those populations. So that's something that we are investigating. And one of the major constraints to that work isn't that the data are not available, because they are in many cases, even in poor countries, but that we don't know the right questions to ask of those data to apply to the climate adaptation question. And I say that with a bit of a giggle because here I am at an academic institution and we're great at asking questions, but we haven't yet cracked the code on how to mine those data for this climate resiliency question.
Well, I agree with Joyce. I would just like to add that we don't expect cities to pay for data. I think that the data that is required to comply with ISO 13485 is readily available at the government with governments. So we don't really expect cities to pay for data. I think that one of the challenges that we have now in this age is that there's probably too much data out there. So sometimes one of the challenges is to try to get the right data. But for compliance with ISO 13485, as I said, I think that it can be obtained easily through census or through at the federal level or provincial level. So no, we don't expect cities to pay for data.
Thank you. We have another question for you, Joyce. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll answer it later. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so we have another question for you, Joyce, from Elisa Zoomer, asking, in downscaling the index to cities, how will you deal with differences in vulnerability, readiness, and equity within a single city?
That's a great question, and so just to add on to the previous question, though, to mention that I think the question had asked very specifically about time series data, so historical data. How are we going to gather that? And I will say that in the case of the Global Adaptation Index, we do not anticipate getting data that are 18 years long for our city scale, because in very few cases in lower income countries, for sure, will that data be available. We were lucky that the data from the World Bank and the United Nations and some of the other peer-reviewed sources that we use, some of them go back that far, others only go back to 2006, and that all is described very readily in our index. But I think we need to be careful not to assert that we will have decades of historic data to look at the city scale, although we do hope we can find at least 6 years to begin to create some trends. And then this question about equity and how to make clarifications within cities is a very fascinating one, because of course I'm addressing this question all the time from the country scale, right? We have one number in the index for all of the United States, for all of Russia, for all of Brazil. Of course, that number is backed up by 46 specific indicators and all of their sources and so on. But the very important nuances within a country or within a city are not described. And that, I think, is a really important thing to understand about any comparable data exercise. In the case of an index, what it is intended to be is a weather report, not a thermometer. In other words, it should indicate something to you that should make you want to investigate it further. So the index is not able to tell very specifically what neighborhoods would be most prone to flooding, or what neighborhoods do not have the social structures in place to deal with extreme heat and the indigent. That would be something that would need to be further explored, but would hopefully be identified through the indicators showing which indicators have potentially the worst scores. And I guess I would also add that there are, of course, many different groups that are able to analyze that in more detail, but it's not the role of the index, of an index generally.
Thank you very much. The last question for today's webinar is from Mario Carmo, a very interesting one, and it's for Jose Luis. And he would like to know, do you use any kind of indicators related to urban biodiversity or ecosystem services?
Well, that's a very good question, and actually it's one of the topics of discussion at the working group number 2 at the ISO level. We have some environment and some urban planning indicators that address like a number of trees or things like that. However, one of the indicators that stakeholders or experts from at the working group level have indicated that they would like to expand on is exactly on biodiversity. So we have few indicators about that. At one point there were some discussions at the working group level to include some of those indicators. One of them that comes to my mind now is, for instance, number of species of you know, measured species or something like that, native species. It's in the standard, but we still see a lot of room to improve on indicators for biodiversity. So I'm sure that the next edition of ISO 37120 will include more indicators on this specific theme.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. As we've come to an end of our time, I would like to conclude our third webinar in the 2014 series here. We would like to give a very warm thank you to Joyce and Jose Luis for sharing their thoughts and experiences, and yeah, to all of you for attending and engaging with us in the discussion today. We have been recording the webinar, and it will be made available on our Resilient Cities series website shortly, together with the presentations. I would also like to invite you to our subsequent webinars in the 2014 series. Please visit our website for more information and to register for the upcoming webinars. Lastly, I would like to remind you that our call for contributions for next year's Resilient Cities Congress closes today. So if you'd like to shape the program of Resilient Cities 2015, which will be held from 8th to 10th of June in Bonn, submit your contributions today. Thank you all for joining us, and have a lovely evening or day.